Even if we see you next
You'll
week.
be good.
He loves it here. Now that he's here,
But it's colder than it was last week.
Testing. Can you hear me? Here? Okay. And this is the right way to do this?
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the lack of air conditioning. This room is perfect, except it doesn't have air conditioning. But somehow we'll make our way through. I'm Mike Ehrman, the chairman of this group, and I welcome you. I have a couple things that I want to get announcements on before we bring Terry on. First of all, Vicki, why don't you mention the, okay?
Well, everyone that comes to this meeting knows that neighbors need neighbors, so on Tuesday night.
Use the microphone, Vicki.
Oh, do I? Okay. Everyone here knows.
Up further.
Everyone here knows neighbors need neighbors. So on Tuesday night, August 7th, the first Tuesday in August, we're asking you to get at your neighbors all together on your street, and we'll be around with the fire trucks and with the goodies and with the mayor, we hope, if not the mayor, the council people. And we hope you get all your neighbors together and you get your problems solved too when you get the politicians there. So call me, we have flyers here, and we'll make it happen. We'll have a good time. You need to know who your neighbors are. Any questions?
Any particular street?
We want you to be the leader to make sure to give out the flyers and get your neighbors together.
Is this part of the National Block Party movement?
Yes, this is part of National Night Out Block Party. They want the whole community to be organized by blocks, so in case of an emergency, we can have good communications, instant communications. You be the leader, take the initiative.
Thank you, Vicki. Vicki has been doing this for a long time.
40 years.
40 years. Can I tell your future story? Vicki's going to be moving to Florida here later at the end of this winter, so take advantage of her and her organizing skills this summer while we're here. I was approached by a member of this group, actually two members of this group, about getting involved for the society in an exciting program that's going to run through all of next year, which has to do with the Jewish influence in Squirrel Hill and the history of the Jewish community. Barbara Burston, who has talked to us before, is part of this. And Laurie Cohen, who was one of the co-authors of our book, is going to come up for just a couple minutes and talk about what that's going to look like and the first talks that are going to be under that program.
Hello. Seems weird. I'm a member of the Jewish Studies. You can't hear me. I'm a member of the Jewish Studies Department at Pitt, and the chair of that program has gotten grants from the Legacy Heritage Jewish Studies program, and there are going to be a series of public lectures and meetings all through next year. You don't have to be Jewish to attend. It's more about the history of Squirrel Hill as an urban community and how it's different from other communities. And there are going to be a lot of really interesting speakers. Just checking the dates here. At the very first, there's going to be a kickoff in September, and Barbara Burston, as Michael mentioned, will be doing a lecture on the history of the Pittsburgh Jewish community, Squirrel Hill in local Jewish context. There's going to be another lecture by Deborah Dashmore, a Jewish historian from the University of Michigan. She'll be talking about Jewish neighborhoods of the interwar period, Squirrel Hill in the national Jewish context. There will be some urban studies specialists, some from Pitt, some national people, and there's going to be a really cool program at the Heinz History Center, sort of like a takeoff on Antiques Roadshow, where the archivist there will be talking and showing, presentations, and you can bring things in, and hopefully somebody will be able to say, oh yeah, the history of that is it came from this particular period, and it was used for this, and there's just a lot of really interesting things going on. There will be publicity about this, and I just kind of wanted to give you a heads up. I'm really excited about it. It's It's probably going to be a series of about 6 or 7 programs throughout the year, and we'll get more information to you when the calendar has been finalized. So it's something to look forward to.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Lori. We are co-sponsoring this program, and one of the things that will come up in May, which I may help out on, is a walking tour of Jewish sites in Squirrel Hill. We're going to do our normal walking tour in June, probably of Chatham, which we haven't been to for a few years, so we may have 2 Squirrel Hill walking tours this year, which looking forward to. We're about ready to get to our speaker. I just want you to make sure and get a list of our programs. You know, we skip it August, and in September we're going to have the history of the Calvary Catholic Cemetery. We've never taken a look at that. And then after that, during the fall, we're going to have the Civil War in Pittsburgh. We're going to have the gentleman who led the archaeological work at the Meadowcroft Shelter down in Washington County. And then Wayne Gerhold from the Urban Coalition is going to come on in December to do a dual talk, sort of reminding us, because we've done this once a few years ago, the history of the Urban Coalition, Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition, and then talk about current projects. Terry Necciai, who's going to come up and talk in just a minute, has been in Pittsburgh before I got here, and he will tell you a little about his background, but one of the things that he decided Squirrel Hill needed was a historical society. Terry, by the way, is an architectural historian and a preservation architect. Did I get that right? And he'll talk a little about that as well. So we had just come to Pittsburgh, I think in late 2000, and I saw a notice at Panera's or something about the Historical Society. And Terry had started a series of lectures, and I got involved. And then because we have to eat, Terry had to move down the road to take some positions out of town. And some of us moved in to take this over. It was going to die, or someone had to run it. And so we took it over and have carried it to where we are today. But Terry was at the beginning. He's going to talk a little about that, and then about some of the interesting projects he's worked on. And we're very, very happy to have you back.
I've got to tell you, I'm happy. I'm going to remember to hold the microphone exactly like this. I was given a little instruction. Would somebody turn the projector on? Ralph, would you?
Projector.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that it works before I start talking. It's the button right by your finger there. Yeah. I'm just not sure how many times you push it. Might need to be pushed once or twice more. Yeah, okay. Because I don't know, I just bought this projector for a talk I gave recently, and I didn't use the advanced button, so I might still be figuring it out while I'm standing up here. Oh, there we are. Well, let me just try to go forward and backward. Let's see if I... Anybody have any... Ralph, do you know how advanced might work?
Not really. I've never used it.
If you don't, I'm going to sit over there. I'd prefer to face everybody. And the other possibility is if we have a small table. Oh, that would work. That would work great. Yeah, and it's all set up for that. Okay. I do kind of like to talk about my background, but it's not, I don't think it's boasting or anything. It's more about how I survived. You know, if you've been thrown into the water and you somehow learned to swim, you want to tell about it. And that's one of the reasons that you're here and I'm here, because I was surviving off of preservation projects about 10 years ago when I lived in Squirrel Hill, and mostly National Register work. And so I'll go back a little further. I'm going to show you some slides, but not quite yet, of even back around the time I came along and was born. Ralph, that puts the projector, if you can come forward on an angle. Yeah, okay. Actually, I was married from 1998 to about 2005, and my wife had already lived in Squirrel Hill for a while, and we lived together here. And she loved this neighborhood, and she protested some of the things that were changing. Unfortunately, we're no longer together, but that's part of the story. And this was sort of my gift to her, to say, well, if you really want somebody to help you fight these protests, you need a group of foot soldiers, and there's nobody talking about history. We have the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition. You know, we're the largest neighborhood in the city, as I understand it. And there are a lot of other great things and unusual things about Squirrel Hill, but we just didn't have a history-oriented organization. And the idea wasn't to get a whole bunch of protesters together, it was to get a whole bunch of people who would just be interested in the history, so that if you all decided to protest something in the future, then maybe you'd all be in place. So I thought it was really ironic that I parked down here off of Forbes Avenue, where I think we had our first protest when they tore down Forbes cottages.
Right.
So that was what Sharon was protesting when we first got together. There was the demolition of Forbes cottages. The Watkins estate was being dismantled. It was about to sell when we knew that. There were a lot of arts people that Sharon knew, and some of them lived here, some of them lived up in Forbes Terrace, some of them lived down in the buildings behind the Morrow Field. And this was the first piece that disappeared, and she was so upset that she went and found several hundred feet of black cloth and made a shroud and installed it all the way around the site. Now, this is incredible art, but it was also a little abstract. Not everybody got it, but I had a couple people pull me aside and say, "Is that who put the shroud up?" So some people got it. But that was because they were tearing down Forbes cottages. Now, I'll go back a little further in my history. I came into this world in what I consider a mixed culture, multicultural background. My father's family were Tuscan Italians who were not very religious, and my mother's family were Scotch-Irish Methodists that had been here for two and a half centuries. And I couldn't figure out how to reconcile all this as I was growing up, and I was the one person paying the most attention. And I had aunts and uncles speaking Italian, and my mother pulling her hair out because she had no idea what they were saying, and all of that stuff. And I grew up in the city of Monongahela, which is, Pittsburgh is an hour north of us, and not the other way around, but I'm very Monongahela-centric. And I happened to decide to go into architecture because my grandfather was a contractor on my mother's side, not the Italian side. And he was actually someone that started as a teamster, when that meant you had 2 horses, you left the farm and started hauling things for people. And he started a hauling business about 1908. He was old enough to be my great-grandfather, and he died when I was 11. So I grew up hearing all these incredible stories. And then after he got ill and died, even when he was ill, I stayed with my grandmother every night instead of my parents, because we had a lot of kids and there wasn't that much room, and I was the oldest. And so she would get up in the morning and we would talk about her grandmother's farm first thing in the morning. And I learned all about Appalachia. I don't know, have any of you ever heard of the Foxfire books?
Yes.
It came out in the 70s, and it was people interviewing, students were interviewing Appalachian people to learn about Appalachian traditions. And when they came out and I started buying them, I was only buying them to make sure that I had this in print, what I already knew. Because my grandmother had already told me many of these things. She used to tell me that they lived down in this little holla, and they had 2 log houses, but one of them wasn't used anymore, and the men would go in there and had a wood shop, and they would spin table legs on a lathe. But then she told me they didn't have electricity. And when I was in woodshop in junior high, I was, well, how did you have a lathe without electricity? Well, as I get toward the end of my talk, I hope I remember to put everything in, but one of the farms I'm working on right now is a farm that has a foot-powered lathe, which is what my grandmother's answer was. There was a branch tied to the ceiling, or nailed to the ceiling on one end, and it was springy, and there was a rope that came down and went around the wood and then around Uncle Aaron's foot, and he had to go like this all day long to make the lathe work. So I was picking up these things, and for me this became really what my interest was. But that was 1970, 75, and I went off to college in 1976, and I knew I wanted to be an architect. I knew that since I was 11, but I didn't know what it meant. And I applied to a bunch of schools, but not very many, and Carnegie Mellon accepted me, and so I decided to come here to Carnegie Mellon. So I was in Squirrel Hill in the 70s, living on the edge of it at Carnegie Mellon. And what I didn't know then was that for about 3 years before that, some universities were offering historic preservation as a major. That whole movement to have historic preservation as a major started in 1973. And I had signed up to a college that taught architecture as a religion of modernism. You know, we had to learn that form follows function and less is more and all that stuff, and we had to know the names of all these famous architects. But I never learned the word Italianate, which is the kind of buildings I really loved in my hometown. They were buildings meant to look like Italy, and they were these buildings with these cool details. In fact, I had some professors give me walking tours and tell me that stuff was all from the hardware store. There was no design in that, it was just stuff. Well, it's not true, and I've had my whole life to study that question and kind of work on it. So I ended up realizing that I really was interested in architecture, but historic preservation. And so I ended up doing a lot of work just documenting historic buildings, to the point where now what I do a lot of times is I write the report that tells other architects what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. So that's kind of where I ended up. And somewhere in the middle, I worked for downtowns for a while with the Main Street program, which is working with merchants. You'll see a little glimpse of that in here. I worked with the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation and a couple other groups like that, and I learned how to do National Register nominations. I have done about 60 National Register nominations. The shortest one was 8 months, but every other one was more than a year. One took me 9 years. So we're not talking about 60 one-month projects, we're talking about 60 years of work. And there aren't very many people that have done that many. But anyhow, that gave me the insights into what it is that makes something historic or not historic, and put me in a position where I could be the person arguing that in these reports. But I designed this talk today. I did start off with a little bit about my background, because I always do, so the slides do that too. But I really thought of it as kind of, what have I done on my summer vacation sort of theme. It's really meant to be an eclectic, fun mix. It occurred to me several years ago. I was with a large firm then, and we were talking about marketing ideas, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to Pittsburgh, to some of the groups I was involved in there, and offer to give them little talks on what we did with that firm. The firm has since downsized, and I'm freelancing again, which is fine. Last year it wasn't fine, but this year it is. But the idea was to come and show you some of these eclectic projects because, and anybody knows me knows this, if I can find a connection back to A, Monongahela, B, Pennsylvania, C, maybe Pittsburgh, that I'll make that connection. And these projects had all these weird connections in them, no matter whether they were in Arkansas or the University of Virginia or Fairfax, Virginia, or North Carolina. I've got those 4 in here, and they have weird connections. So that's my theme, is the connections you can make back. I do hope that you think as I go through these, the things that do relate to Squirrel Hill. I have done a lot of work on farm landscapes recently, and that's what the last 10 slides are. I know this is not a farm. However, I think you'll find things that will relate, and you'll find ways to connect it. And some of the town stuff will relate. So I guess I'll just kind of take it from there, and then we'll go on this fun ride together. Okay, this is a little city where I was born, and I'd love to show this slide, because if I hadn't told you anything about where I was from, you might guess lots of places. Philadelphia looks like that. Boston, in some blocks, looks like that. Some neighborhoods, like the East Ohio Street, looks like that. That building on the right is a large Italianate-style building. I mentioned that a minute ago. And it happens to be approximately the year I was born. And my mother worked in one of the banks on the left. And the fire wasn't major. It didn't destroy the buildings. But when the fire broke out, everybody ran out in the street, and that's how many people were inside of our store buildings. So this is the city of Monongahela in 1958. Now, while I was at Carnegie Mellon, the city of Monongahela went through a couple of changes. One change that was coming, I'll just mention, I managed to get here really fast. I was running late, but I got here on a highway called the Mon Valley Expressway. I know there are a lot of people in Pittsburgh that either are opposed to it, which I actually honor their opinion, but I wanted to know the other side. My little city's mayor actually read an editorial in the paper in 1950-something. He was a young guy. And it said that Mayor Lawrence thought that Pittsburgh was being treated like the stepchild of Pennsylvania. And so Bill Pulaski wrote a letter to the Post-Gazette that said, if Pittsburgh's the stepchild, we're not even in the family. And he told me personally, he died about 15 years ago, but he told me personally that that was about the moment when he started pushing for a 4-lane highway to get in and out of the Mon Valley. And this is not the Mon Valley like Homestead. That's just 1 mile from here. This is 25, 30 miles, 60 miles from here. The grassroots in the Mon Valley were pushing for that highway. I'm not so sure that they built the best highway, but we have about 60 miles of highway, and I was able to go pretty fast until I got to where it ends. But that's one of the things that was happening in the 50s. Another thing is, we are the second smallest city chartered in Pennsylvania. There's one place of 800 people called Parker, which is the smallest chartered city. Many boroughs are larger than Monongahela. We have about 4,000 people, and our post office area serves about 20,000. But we have a very large school district. It's Ringgold School District, which is 7 different municipalities. But as the second smallest city, and this is something I had to learn in a big hurry in Pittsburgh, at Carnegie Mellon, we were last in line for urban renewal money. So while I was learning at Carnegie Mellon how bad urban renewal was, we were doing it. So you are now seeing the before, and let me show you what happened while I was in college.
Oh.
That's exactly the same intersection. And so my preservation career has been about saving that place, but I have to take you a couple blocks in any direction to get you past McDonald's. I mean, there's nothing left in the center. And that's the center of a 200-year-old town that spent 200 years evolving. Those buildings you just saw were by one major architect that I've been able to study and write about. But it went away. And so for years I tried to make a career there, but I found that I had to spread out and work in a lot of towns, including in Pittsburgh. But I've also found that I work best in the 724 area. I'm a better fit out there. So I thought about naming my firm Architecture 724, because when they split the area code, and you guys kept 412, and we kept 724, that's the best way I can explain. Anyhow, we'll go on to the next slide. So I've moved from the second smallest city in Pennsylvania, gradually moving east in a number of incremental moves. I was in Alexandria for a few years, 7 years I think, and then I ended up moving 3 years ago to Pennsylvania's largest city. So I thought about writing a book about big city, little city, because to get back to that kind of buildings, I now had to go to Philadelphia. But this is Queen Village, where I now live, which is, if you know South Street, which used to be the south border of William Penn's original city, go to the east end. South Street is a business district that I think of today, it has lots of good and bad about it, but I think of it as the hippie Main Street. It's kind of our Haight-Ashbury or something, and it's full of all kind of kooky places and things. Some of them are a little too sleazy. But just a few blocks south of there is a neighborhood called Queen Village, which is half of the municipality called South Wark. South Wark was merged into the city of Philadelphia in 1854. I joined the Preservation Committee a year ago in my neighborhood, and I'm so proud that they are now starting to call themselves the South Wark Historical Society. I'm just going to brag for a second. This really is bragging, because it's your work. You guys have done such a tremendous job with this organization. I'm so glad I left. I'm so glad you've done so much since I left. I've come back a couple of times to another group I helped start in Monessen. There's a Monessen Italian Historical Society that only exists because I knew how to get a grant to do something one time, and they kept meeting after the grant, and they get like 100 people at a meeting. So, but I don't know, that might not go on forever. Maybe that was the last I heard, but they went for 10 years with 100 people at a meeting. But South Wark, our neighborhood preservation committee of the Queen Village Neighbors Association is calling itself a historical society, and they just retained me in the last couple of weeks to write a new statement of significance about the neighborhood. Why is the neighborhood significant? And I've got a number of themes. These are buildings very close to the waterfront, which is the Delaware, and these were catch-as-catch-can architecture, but they were for the workers, very tiny houses, and today they're very expensive rentals, and sometimes one of these houses will be 3 houses deep, because Philadelphia's houses are what they divide them into trinities. They take 1 room per floor, and it's 3 floors tall, and then they find a staircase for the next 3 rooms, and a staircase for the next 3 rooms. And that's what I have, is sort of, it's blocked from here, but my house is about that wide, and it's 1 room per floor. And I'm just renting. I'm thinking I'm probably going to move, but I have one large project in Philadelphia right now, so plus this one. But it used to be a rundown neighborhood, and here's an example of what it looked like 100 years ago. Let's go on to the next slide. It's not only that theme, though. The last slide I showed has a tower in it that I'm going to come back to where it was one of our industries. This is 4th Street, which is one of several enclaves that was Jewish in Queen Village. And it's called Fabric Row. They claim it's the oldest fabric row in America. I don't know any other fabric rows. But Philadelphia has a Jewish row and a fabric row. And it's a lot of Russian families. And it's 4 blocks from me. But right behind my house is what was originally a Baptist church, which became a synagogue. They call it, but then it became a condo. Right now it's a condo. But it was called the Nezhiner Shul. The people were all from this town in either Russia or Ukraine, I don't remember, but they were from a town called Nezhin. And so there was a synagogue right behind me, and there's several others still functioning in the neighborhood. But I understand some of my committee members, they were all focused on the 1700s. And I kept saying, we have great storefronts, we should be doing more with these. And they went over to try to drum up some interest in one of our events. And the people started telling them, well, this used to be so-and-so, and my uncle lived over there, and they had that business. And it was sort of, they realized there's living history there that we should be working with. And it's very similar to Squirrel Hill in that sense. Okay, let's go. I did a talk for my neighborhood group a couple months ago called Tall Buildings of Queen Village. And one of the reasons is because I was interested in these 2 buildings. The one on the left is called Sparks Shot Tower. There were 2 families, one of them was Quaker, who got in the business in 1810 of making shot, which is lead for muskets, lead balls for muskets. But one of the ways you can make them, I made them as a kid, with a little mold, but it ends up with a little bump on one end, and then it's not as good. But the way you make a perfectly round one is you go up a stairs in a tower, and you melt the lead at the top, and you drop it through a sieve like rain, and it gets to the bottom and it lands in water, and somehow it's perfectly round. It's part of the science of how lead works. So they started in 1810 and they built this tower, and there's another one like it in Boston, Baltimore, and there are about 3 others in the United States, but some of you may have seen the one in Baltimore as tourists. But that's in my neighborhood. It's now actually part of a playground. It's really weird. You can't quite see it unless you stand back because everything's so dense. But so we did a little talk about that. And one of the things that I got excited was that that building relates to lighthouses, and I had worked on some lighthouses. So I'm going to show you some lighthouses later. And the building on the right is Emmanuel Lutheran Church, which used to be surrounded by buildings, but they tore them all down to put in housing. But it's actually almost identical to my home church, the First Methodist Church in Monongahela, which I'm currently working on. So that's one of the segues, that these connections I'm making. Go to the next slide. So here's my home church, but the steeple got cut off. But you'll see in a moment what they did. Probably based on a pattern book that Samuel Sloan, a Philadelphia architect, put out in 1850-something. And virtually identical to Emmanuel Lutheran. They all have very similar characteristics. The crown and the steeple is picked up there. That's not this steeple, but the round arch windows and the corbel rows and the rose window and so forth. There's a lot of similarities. Okay, let's go ahead. But in my church, there were 7 steeples on Main Street, and we had the tallest one. We were the biggest congregation. And we went all the way to Philadelphia, 300 miles for an architect in 1863. I think if the Pennsylvania Railroad hadn't been completed to Pittsburgh just 11 years earlier, how could you bring an architect 300 miles? And that architect actually a few years earlier had done the main train station in Harrisburg, which later got torn down and replaced by the current train station, railroad station. But he designed this church, and it took them 9 years to build it. It was such a big deal. And the last year, they were still figuring out how to get the bell in and things like that. But it was interesting. The architect had died, and they were fighting over, let's not change the plan. Well, we could change the plan. No, we don't want to change the plan. And I'm finding that in the minutes as I've researched it. But it was potentially a copy, or arguably a copy, of First Presbyterian of York, which Joseph C. Hoxie did both. He did it a year or 2 earlier. The difference is the Presbyterians weren't so emphasizing of Sunday school, but the Methodist Church raised the building up so the sanctuary is on the 2nd floor to get a big Sunday school. And the Presbyterians didn't, but this gives a better structural shape. So this is actually potentially a copy with that main change. And when you do that, then you fill in these two areas with staircases, and that structurally helps hold up the steeple on 3 sides. So there's a whole lot of cool stuff that we figured out. We also figured out that the steeple came all the way down to here, inside behind the brick. This is like a brick curtain. And so when they tore it down, they decided to put bells in here, but they used the bottom of the steeple as the support, and a couple years ago the church had an engineer tell them that was all collapsing. So I had to come in and kind of convince them, no, I don't think you want to go as far as he wants to go. So we had dueling engineers for a while. But this is the church now, and in 1925 a local lumber dealer donated 11 bells, which with the internet you can learn all kinds of crazy things. This is the 148th largest number of bells in any church in North America. There are 147 larger numbers, but they're almost all in cities. It's the largest number of bells in any small town church, probably in Pennsylvania. So that's what they were worried about collapsing, was all that weight. And we're now working on figuring out how to fix it, because we figured out the first engineer didn't know what he was talking about. We had to prove that. We did things like wood pathology, where we drilled into the wood with a needle, it's like a coat hanger, and it has a little seismograph, and it tells you how much wood is hollow. So where the first engineer said, I think it's hollow, the second engineer proved it wasn't. Things like that, and we were able to prove that the belfry was okay. I was on the phone today working on this one. I should have been working on my slides. So, okay, let's go one further. Okay, so back to that idea about the shot tower and the lighthouses. I had done work through my old firm on several lighthouses. How many of you have been to the Outer Banks? People love lighthouses in the Outer Banks. I can't connect it to Monongahela, so I almost left it out. But I can connect it to Pennsylvania. They actually, supposedly, when they were about to build these, there are a whole bunch of these. There's 3 of them in the Outer Banks, there's one in Florida, there's one in San Francisco. They put them in different places, but they did it because you needed to see light from 18 miles out, because the boats kept running ashore in North Carolina, and the light was intentionally designed to be bright enough and high enough that you could see it that far away. So it's called a first-order lighthouse lens. And they needed to get up to that height, and they decided the way to do it would be to copy Spark Shot Tower's engineering. So they came to Philadelphia to study that tower and then duplicated it in 1872. It was 62 years later.
Is that the lighthouse that they moved inland?
It's very near it. They're about 20 miles apart, and that's the next one south, which is Currituck, I think. I think it's, yeah. And there's another one at Duck, North Carolina, that's 30 miles north of here, that's identical to this one. The one they moved is slightly different. It's a little more classical looking. They're all the same height, and they all need to be about 30 miles apart, because you need to see them from 18 miles, even when you're close to shore. So I had a really cool job on this. My firm was subs. My firm was John Milner Associates. They're a firm out of Westchester, Pennsylvania. They're architects and archaeologists. And architects are almost always the prime contractor for design. But we were the subs to an engineering firm out of Atlanta. And the interesting thing was that this lighthouse had been a functional lighthouse till a couple of years ago, and now the Park Service owns it. And there's all this pressure to let people inside. But these stairs were designed for a guy to carry 10 gallons of whale oil up the stairs every night to light the light. Everything's designed. When you create something that tall, you have a chimney effect, and it was all designed to ventilate a certain way. And they thought that's where the water was coming in, so they sealed it all up, and it causes it not to work right, and things like that. The lighthouse worker slept up here, and during the day he went out and cleaned the windows, and he had to be able to hang on to a rail while he was doing it. So it's all designed for that. He would go out and watch the boats coming in from the deck, and right here is a floor made out of glass shaped like prisms, and that was so that he could sleep in the room underneath at night, but at night's when the light needs to be on. And those prisms were designed that if the light ever went out, he would train himself to wake up. So the light was constantly bathing him, and when it stopped, he had to go upstairs and relight the light. And there was only whale oil for a couple of years, and they switched, this was the oil house, they switched to natural gas or something, and eventually electricity, and then they decided they didn't need it because of modern technology. But it had this staircase that was 150 feet, 15 stories of these metal steps, and somebody went up to the top to fix the electricity in 1992 and dropped a piece of equipment, and it broke through 4 of the steps. And what scares, I said 15, I think it's 10 stories, and they're about 15 feet tall. But what scares me is I wouldn't know how to get back down, because every step, you'd fall down to the next step and fall through it. So you would have to make sure that because each step holds up all the other steps. It's all held together by a certain kind of sandwiched engineering of metal. And so to replace those steps, which were at the bottom, we had to gradually lift it 1/4 of an inch, and we had to take out a tread and send it off to a foundry to be recast, and it had to be recast 15% larger because iron shrinks when it's recast, and then it had to be slid in there. And there was a construction firm that did all that, but I got to just sit there. I was at the beach for 4 days, but I wasn't really at the beach. Sit there and watch them lift and lower this little piece of metal. And I just thought that was such a cool story. And it was all made at a foundry in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and on the back of some of the stair treads is cast the word Phoenixville. So it does have a Pennsylvania connection other than just the lighthouse, the Park Shot Tower. We'll go on to the next one. Here's a house I got to work on in Fairfax. I was the architect assigned by my firm for the exterior restoration. It did look like this, which is very pretty, but there were a lot of things that weren't right. The roof needed to be redone, and the shrubbery was too tall, and the bricks needed a lot of work. And the porch wasn't quite the right design, but we only modified it a little because we don't know exactly what was there originally. But the reason this house was being worked on is because in the Fairfax area, when the Yankees came through in the Battle of Manassas, which is really 3 battles, they took over all the houses and used them as hospitals. And a lot of people were losing limbs and things in the war, things like that, but most of the people in the hospitals had dysentery, and they were delirious, and it was a really bizarre thing that we left behind. We weren't, if we're the Yankees, but we're probably not the Yankees, but we left behind trashed houses all over the place. But the family that built this was one of the founding families of Fairfax, and we know they built it right as the war was starting because their old house burned down, and we have the insurance record. And they built it, and they hadn't finished curing the plaster. The plaster was made on the farm out of lime, and it needed to cure for a couple of years, so you didn't paint or wallpaper at first. You had white walls. And they ran away when the Yankees came. And then the war ended for a while, or the battle ended, and they came back, and they whitewashed the walls, because the Yankees left graffiti all over the walls. And then the Yankees came back and they left again, and then they put another layer of graffiti on top of the whitewash. And the family was so fascinated by this that they wallpapered most of the rooms and left the attic completely bare so you could read all this graffiti. There's everything from religious hymns, dirty poems, things in German that you can't even read the handwriting anymore because it's that Fraktur script, tic-tac-toe, and 2 scenes of officers at brothels. So I'll let you leave the rest of your imagination. But they drew all over the walls, and this particular guy gives us a clue. Many of them say where they're from. This guy was Christian Spiegel from Pittsburgh. These were recent German immigrants who had come to Pittsburgh to work in the iron industry, and they got involved in the war and ended up delirious with dysentery in this hospital and wrote all over the walls. So I thought you'd find it interesting. I found a connection. It's not to Monongahela, but it's we'll go to the next. And so we did restore the outside, and this just gives you a little bit more feel for some of what we did to go on. Or here's another one I got to work on. I'll just tell a story because I love to tell these crazy stories. But after I was at Carnegie Mellon, I really wanted to go to graduate school, and I applied to a bunch of graduate schools, and I went for a year to Mississippi after this, but I applied to the Ivy League schools first. And then I decided I was going to try to go to the University of Virginia. And I called down there. I said, I'd like to make an appointment to talk to somebody. Well, we don't do that. You just show up and somebody comes out and talks to you. So I got my portfolio and my last $100, and I drove down to Virginia and stayed in a hotel room. And I went to meet this guy the next day, and he glanced at my portfolio, which probably means it was really bad. And he said, son, we're a state-funded school. We have a better reputation than that, but we're a state-funded school, so we have to take Virginians first, and we've already got our quota of people from Pennsylvania. I could have killed him. So I had a vendetta against the University of Virginia. When the firm told me they were assigning me to work on the president's house, it was like, well, I could bomb the place. But anyhow, I got to write the history of the President's House for a historic structure report, which is one of the kinds of reports that I write. And what was fascinating about this one was my assignment was this. The architect Stanford White with McKim and White had designed this building in 1906 for the first president. The university went without a president, but then they had a big fire, and they decided they needed a president 60 years after, or 80 years after Thomas Jefferson founded them, or 90 years, I'm not going to get that right. But anyhow, the first president came up from Louisiana, and he said he wanted a house like this house he'd seen in New Orleans. And he gave Stanford White a drawing and said, do this. Well, you know, most architects wouldn't do that if you told them, but Stanford White was the last architect that was going to do that. So Stanford White changed the Doric to the Ionic, and he did a whole bunch of those kinds of things. And he got a nasty letter from the president that said, we are very unhappy with your design, and we're probably not going to use your firm in the end, but we're going to give you one more chance, and Mrs. Alderman, my wife, will be in New York on Monday to meet with you, or Tuesday. That was the morning after, or the morning before. Morning before he was shot by Harry Kendall Thaw from Pittsburgh.
Oh no.
And Harry Kendall Thaw is a Hillman, and you've probably heard of the Hillmans, but I've also heard of the Hillmans because they had poor cousins in Monongahela who had 13 kids and lived in a 3-room house. And we have pictures of Harry Kendall Thaw coming to visit his cousins on the Hillman side, the poor Hillmans. So anyhow, I thought it was kind of fun that I could connect all those dots. Mike?
Terry, it's interesting. Thomas Jefferson was consistent. He got Virginia not to have a president, and he had the governors in Virginia only can run for one term. He distrusted those leaders.
Or he liked democracy, yeah. So this is President Alderson, and that's Stanford White and Harry Kendall Thaw and so forth. And Mike tells me you had a speaker about that, so I won't get into all the sexcapades and stuff that were going on behind the scenes in that trial. But anyhow, another project that I did was further south, and I didn't think the building was that interesting, but the story was a house in Arkansas called the Drennan Scott House. It's where the Indian agent for the whole Oklahoma Territory lived, at the western edge of Arkansas, and he was handing out the money to the Native Americans that would come through in the Trail of Tears. And he lived here, and this house had grown incrementally, and we spent several years studying it, trying to figure out what part was what, and how old was this, and how could we restore it, because now it's an interpretation center for the University of Arkansas for a museum studies program they have. But I pointed out to my firm later when I did a little presentation on some things that Drennan actually was Scotch-Irish from Elizabeth Township across the river from Monongahela, and I have his farm here on this map. So, anyhow, there's always a connection. Okay. Back to the lighthouses a second. When I got to work on 2 lighthouses, the other one was a little cottage lighthouse. Those are 4th order lights, the smaller ones. They were put in rivers, and the cottages are often on top of a bunch of lacy metal stuff that holds them up out of the water, and a lot of them crashed. But this was one that had survived, and somebody moved it to land and made it a home, and they were going to move it again to make it a museum. And I got to study the 4th order light, which is like table size, compared to the one in Body Island, which you can walk into. So there's a comparison there. But I actually had been working just before that on a historic district in the Mon Valley for the town of Charleroi, 5 miles from Monongahela, where I used to be in charge of the downtown before I moved here. And Charleroi was built for the glass industry, and it was the only place in America, the only place anywhere, I think, where they cast lighthouse lenses. This lighthouse lens says F. Barbier, which is a company in Paris. They made almost all the lighthouse lenses in the world, and they made them by grinding the glass by hand into all these shapes that scattered the light in a lens fashion. It's the equivalent of a lens that's really curved, but you slice it and then flatten it out in your mind. You know, you make a curve and then slice it, flatten it out, and then you grind those shapes out of glass, and that'll throw the light the same way that a round lens that was more curved would do. So anyhow, the Barbier company was in Paris, but in the Mon Valley we had a large Belgian settlement of glass experts who worked for a glass factory that moved out there from Pittsburgh. It was Macbeth Evans, and they were lens and bottle glass originally, and they moved out in 1893, and they kept changing what they made because they were originally the world's largest oil lamp chimney factory. Well, oil lamps went out of fashion right about the year they built the plant because the electric light bulb showed up. So they had to come up with other products, and one of the things they did was made lighthouse lenses, and they made the ones for the lighthouses at the Panama Canal. So more connections that connect back and forth. So these are products from the Macbeth Evans plant, including the fourth order lighthouse light that they've made here. But this is from a book on the plant from 1918 that shows all the things they made. They made the schoolhouse type light fixtures, usually the bell shape, but this is more of a church shape. They made all the lenses for automobiles in the first few years, millions of them. And they made the first glass block, but by the 1930s they were making depression glass. Oil lamp chimneys, and when the electric light came in, they had to start making white glass because electric light burns your eyes. If you look at it, it's a lot worse on your eyes than oil lamps are. So they made white glass, and then when the cities stopped buying the lights for the streets, they started stamping them into white dishes. So all that white Pyrex that you've eaten off of in diners and things came out of that story. Pyrex was made in Charleroi. Corning eventually bought the plant, and it became part of the Corning complex. Oh, the tops of gas station pumps, too, that they had at that time. So Charleroi was where I was working around 1990 as a Main Street manager for the downtown, 87 to 90. It was started in 1890, and it was, they call it the Magic City. And this banner says, the Magic City is not 5 years old, but give us 5 more years like 1890, and we will be part of the greater Pittsburgh. They had a guy who was an expert on making towns happen really fast, and he came up with all this hype. And he apparently had founded a whole lot of towns. Coriopolis is sort of in this connection. Jeanette. I can go all over western Pennsylvania, but he also went to the Akron area and founded a town called Barberton. And then he came back and did Monessen and Denora, which are younger than Charleroi. He just kept creating these towns, but he had a cartel of people, and a lot of them were Pittsburghers, including the Sellers family from the Sellers Carnahan House, which is over next to Calvary Church. That was one of the glass industrialists from Pittsburgh. The Chambers family, the McGee family, were all connected to this big cartel that was creating all these glass factories. Glass was made with coal until 1880, and then they figured out that natural gas made clearer glass. So until 1880, the pattern was it made sense to, if you started a glass factory, to move to Pittsburgh because the coal floats downriver, and that's where all the coal was. But as soon as they started using natural gas, the pattern reversed because you couldn't have very many glass factories in one town. So Jeanette and Charleroi and Belle Vernon and Newaygo and Washington and Ford City and Morgantown and Wheeling all became glass centers as a result of that. A big circle around Pittsburgh, 1 to 2 hours drive. Go ahead. So I was working on these buildings in the 80s, but we had a centennial in 1980s to 1990, and they made a little bit of money on the centennial, and I commented to someone, well, you should have used that to get the town on the National Register. Well, 10 years later, the right people weren't involved anymore, and then they called me and said, will you do this National Register nomination immediately? And we have $10,000. It was actually, I was calculating in my mind on the way in today, it was about 1.5 years of man hours. It took me four years to do, and I ended up taking the job with John Milner Associates in the middle of it and had to come back on the weekends every weekend and drive down all the alleys in Charleroi to make records on 2,500 buildings, or at least 1,800, but there are 2,500 in the town. We put almost the whole town on the National Register because there wasn't a clear line between one part of it and another. It was built so fast. They laid out 1,000 lots, and they got like 2,000 residents within a month. And by the end of the year, they had to lay out the neighboring farm. So almost the entire town is one story. And it's the only town I know of that has a birthday, and every year they have a birthday cake. March 4th is Charleroi's birthday. In fact, this guy who was originally from Virginia, who was booming the town, he created the name Magic City. There are a couple other towns that call themselves Magic City because he was involved. He said in the newspaper 3 days after the town started, he said, it took us 8 months to do in Jeanette what we did in Charleroi in 3 days. So he was very impressed with himself, but he was promoting it at the same time. Let's keep going. A lot of it is these little two window wide houses, and there happens to be some buildings that were torn down in the middle of this, so it allowed me to get a panoramic view of it with 2 images. But it's really, really interesting, and they're all on the National Register. I was able to call them all contributing, even though architecturally they all have changed windows and awnings and things like that, but the rhythm is there. Let's go back one slide for a second. I just want to comment, I call this the postcard row, but it's one of our 2 main streets, and it has all these Flemish fronts and things because they were trying to look like Belgium. But those little stores they would only be there with a light bulb. They're very small and very long, very narrow and very long. And so they made ideal spaces for certain kinds of stores and not others. They were good for restaurants. We had 40 restaurants. We have 4,000 people in Charleroi. They were good for shoe stores. And if a shoe store started to thrive, they moved next door and opened a second one because they couldn't connect them well enough. Well, we had 13 shoe stores. I don't think you'll find another town that had. When I worked there, we only had 5. But that's still more than any other town in America. But a lot of those, there were 2 kinds of families in the shoe business. There were the Italian cobblers that had started shoe businesses, and there were the Jewish families. And Charleroi had an important Jewish community that went all the way back to the 1890s. It was one of about 10 ethnic groups that had shown up there. But I noticed when the shoe stores finally did start to fail, I started running into the guys at Little's because they had cousins that gave them jobs at Little's. So this is all connected to your community. Okay, this was one of the farm projects. I get called to do a lot of work on farms. A lot of it has to do with they're mining under a lot of the farms, and I get asked to put them on the National Register as fast as I can because the coal mine takes a year and the National Register takes a year. Coal mine license takes a year. And it doesn't stop the coal mine, but it's the best thing you can do in a lot of cases to try to get them. Pennsylvania changed this law in 1996 to allow you to mine under farmhouses. And so this isn't a mining story, but it's one of the more recent farmhouses that I did. It's the southernmost important house in Allegheny County. It's right across the river from Monongahela, which is the very edge of Allegheny County. It's called the Allen House. In Jamie Van Trump's book, it's called the Allen Reisner House because the Reisners lived there. But the Allens were in-laws to the founders of Monongahela. It was built in 1815, and by the time it was finished, there was a glass factory in Monongahela making windows. So I think that the brother-in-law, I think that they probably got the glass from there, and that we could probably pretty well guess that that's the kind of glass they were making right across the river. Monongahela was one of the first glass-making places in the Pittsburgh system. There were about 8 other places. But I'm going to show you something here. This is not the same house. This house is in Charles Morse Stotts' book, Early Architecture of Western Pennsylvania. It happens to be located a little further south in Ross River Township, and it's called the Daly House. And it has this doorway, and yet it's very similar. It's similar enough that I think this architect or builder, which is about 20 years later, copied these details. Or it was the same person using the same patterns. And let me show you a couple. I got to go that far. Notice the arch. The owner of this house died right before it was finished, so I think he never put the ink to finish this design, but I think it's the same design. On the inside, it does the same thing, but this is a replacement door and it's got slightly different panels. The stair risers do the same thing. So there's a whole lot of interesting things. And I'm just kind of saying this is the cool stuff I get to do. I've only gotten this far with one house so far, but I think that if we ever keep looking at these historic buildings close enough, we might start to figure out this one's a copy of that one, you know. And I had more I could have shown, but I figured I'd just put a couple slides in. Okay, now I thought I'd throw this one in at the same time. These were both about a year ago, and I was asked by this owner if I could get it on the National Register. Somebody else had already said that it was eligible as part of the Mon Valley Expressway project. It's very close to the expressway. But when we went forward, I'm showing you one that didn't work. They wouldn't take this for the National Register after they knew more about it. The owner, and it's very much to their credit, it was collapsing when they bought it. They put a new roof on it, but the roof's not quite historically accurate. They put new windows in, they're vinyl. They put new shutters on. The inside has a lot of cool stuff that you would put in an old house, kind of barn-like, in the 70s, but it's not a restoration. And the farm, I could have argued that it was a great farm landscape, but it wasn't, because they had sliced the farm and ended up with the barn from the neighboring farm, and they just moved the lines around so that it really wasn't the original farm layout anymore, and a lot of things were missing. But it did have a really cool spring house and so forth. But it had an even cooler story, and I'll tell you this one. How many of you know where Brownsville is? Okay. You know what the saying is about Brownsville and Pittsburgh? John, you know what saying is. In the Mon Valley, we were always reminding ourselves that we just happened to be next to this big city. But the saying from the 1700s supposedly is that Pittsburgh might amount to something if it weren't so close to Brownsville. Well, Brownsville was the other important town as you went west. You had two ways to go west, on Route 40 or Route 30. Route 30 went through Pittsburgh, Route 40 went through Brownsville. If you went overland on Route 40, which is the old National Road, you could get on a boat at Brownsville and go all the way to New Orleans. You just happened to bypass Pittsburgh. If you came on 30, you would do that at Pittsburgh. So they both kind of did the same thing, but Brownsville is where the overland and water routes crossed, and Pittsburgh's kind of where the overland route turned to the water route. And Monongahela is in between on a connecting road that also went east-west in the 1700s, starting in the 1760s. But this family was the Colvins. They showed up when it was illegal to live in western Pennsylvania. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but the British didn't know, they had given the land, they recognized that the land belonged to the Iroquois. And it wasn't the Iroquois that lived here, it was some bands of smaller cousins, smaller bands of cousins. But they, the Iroquois complained that the settlers were showing up. Well, they were showing up because they were showing up next to the forts. And there was a fort in Brownsville that was contemporary with Fort Pitt. And the Colvins showed up to plant grain to sell it to the soldiers. Somebody has to produce the food for these guys. They were planting grain in 1761. I think that's the earliest date that anybody has for growing farm goods in western Pennsylvania. They moved 3 times, but their first farm was right in Brownsville. This is not their first farm, it's their 3rd farm. So we'll go to the next slide. I've done a lot of work in this small town of Brownsville, which is really 3 towns. This is the original Brownsville called the North Side. This is South Brownsville, which was a Quaker town called Bridgeport originally. And the west side of Washington County is called West Brownsville. And altogether, it still only adds up to 3,000 people. But it gave Pittsburgh a run for its money. And when they built the canals, for instance, they canalized the river. They made the river into a canal by building the locks and dams. Brownsville paid for about 1/4 of it. Pittsburgh paid for about 1/2 of it, but the other towns along the river paid for it too. So it wasn't just Pittsburgh doing for us, it was us doing for what helped Pittsburgh. This town goes back to the 1740s when the fort was here, and there's a house here called the Castle now, called the Castle. And I've had a chance to do a whole lot of projects. I didn't bring any slides of specifics, but this little connector, which is very narrow, is called the Neck. And we did a report on 9 business buildings in the Neck, which mostly are abandoned because one guy bought the whole downtown and tried to speculate on riverboat gambling and held it hostage for 20 years. And they've just taken back these 100 buildings that he bought, but in between there were families that couldn't keep their businesses going, so they gave theirs to the community group. So about every 5th building belongs to the community group, and the rest belongs in this big group that had to be taken back. So anyhow, a little bit about Brownsville, but I just threw it in, it kind of segues from the farms for a second. This, I unfortunately didn't get an exterior, but this is an 1873 bank building that really looks like a house. And they're going to make it into a bed and breakfast. And just yesterday I was there. They have small grants. It's in Brownsville. And it was a very, very wealthy family who was doing iron and steel before anybody in Pittsburgh was. They were 1795, they were making nails in Brownsville. And these first iron furnaces, which were in Fayette County, were there because they needed the iron in Brownsville to make the nails. But this was the bank started by that family, and it's going to become a bed and breakfast, and we're putting a new metal roof on it, and I was just there yesterday to work out the details for the new metal roof go forward. So I'm going to just take you back to this slide for a second. Do you see these crazy quilt shapes? Have any of you done research on patent maps? Do you know what patent maps are? You would have patent maps for Squirrel Hill, but Squirrel Hill was probably about 5 farms total. But these are the original farms. And the boundaries were often 300 acres. Warranty Atlas is another name, yeah. And this is the Allegheny County one, which I think they call it that. Some of them are sometimes just called patent names. I've been studying these with each one of the farms, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to take you on a little jaunt through some of the farm stuff. Let's go. I keep pointing to the camera, but it's you. This is the most wonderful farm there is. I'm getting to work on, and I wrote a draft last year, and now I'm going to be revising it the next few months. It's called Plantation Plenty. It's in Washington County. It's western edge of the county, right outside of Wellsburg, West Virginia. And this family came as a wealthy family from Rhode Island in 1815. So it's the same year as that other house we just saw. And they built this incredibly refined house, and I didn't come in real tight on any of the photos, but the window panes in this house do things that you don't find on any other house. They wanted the upper story windows to be shorter than the first floor, and they could have done that by making each pane of glass shorter, but instead they cut the top pane in half. And it's just a little crazy decision that an architect made, but we don't know who. We just know somebody very sophisticated designed this. It's one of the only farms that still has the original 400 acres. Anybody know what an acre is?
600.
You all know it's a measurement, right?
42,000 square feet.
42,000 square feet.
600.
But it actually is, and it varies from country to country, so that's only in this country. It's actually...
You know where a section is.
Yeah. An acre is 1 day's work with a team of oxen, a man, and a plow. So it's the amount of land you can plow in a day, and many of these farms were 365 acres because they didn't believe anybody should have any more than 1 acre per day per year. And so their patents were very frequently that size, but you could only really keep up 100 acres. And so they divided them among 3 sons, and that explains how the farms got divided up. And you might have 6 kids, but you married 3 of the girls off to your neighbor's kids, and then and then you might have 3 other kids that went west, but you ended up with 3 farms out of the 1 farm. And I've been studying that relationship for a long time. If you go to Virginia, let's go back to Virginia for a second. You were allowed in Virginia to have as many acres as you wanted. What goes with that? Slavery. You can't manage that many acres, 10,000 or so acres, without slaves. So the people in Washington County thought they were in Virginia, and they didn't want to give up on that because some of them had slaves and because they wanted larger tracts of land. But this is the average, it's a large 400-acre farm, but there were larger ones. We'll go on to the next one. It's a beautiful house. It has incredible finishes. It went on the National Register, a nomination that Jamie Van Trump wrote in 1972, but it was written from the point of view of a Pittsburgh architectural historian. He didn't know how to describe the barn. He didn't know what he was looking at in the tool shed. He just focused on how pretty the windows were and the doorways and the fireplaces. So when he did, he only talks about 5 buildings, and the other 400 acres aren't on the National Register. So I'm getting to revise the National Register to get all 20 buildings and all 400 acres on. It's last year it was on the National Trust list of 11 most endangered sites in Pennsylvania because they're considering mining under it. And it wouldn't have made the list except that it's the finest farm that has that threat. But the Post-Gazette covered it last year. It's incredible. This family since the 1790s has kept every piece of paper. They just recently put them in the archival boxes, but the great-great-great-grandfather belonged to a mechanics society, which kind of means a craftsman's guild, in Rhode Island in 1795, and his membership certificate's there, 2 years before he moved west. There are letters back and forth to relatives saying, we're building onto the house, or we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It was a frontier log fort when they got there.
What was the name?
The Manchester family. And it actually, in the National Trust stuff, it shows up as a Manchester farm, if you want to look that up or anything. Okay, let's go back for 1 second. Also, it's unusual in that they framed the attic like it was a barn. It's not just a brick house, it's got framing in it too. And this is the original lane. The bridge has started, a long time ago, the bridge started to collapse. The earlier family that had the log fort had a distillery here, and this is the only distillery left in the Whiskey Insurrection area. There's one 1810 one, but this is the only one that's earlier than the Whiskey Insurrection and still standing in the entire area where the Whiskey Insurrection happened. It was converted to the family gave up on alcohol because they were prohibitionists later, so they used it as an electric plant. This is a spring house, but it was big enough to make cheese, and on the first floor they have this shed, and that was for a dog to run around on a track in a circle, and the dog would turn a wheel, and the wheel would turn the butter churn, because they were producing so much butter they couldn't handle all the churning. So they had to hold meat out the window and tantalize this poor dog to get the dog to turn the butter churn. Go to the next. The distillery and the tool shed both had an unusual kind of framing, which I'm finding a little suspect, because this was supposedly built by the first guy who was from Pennsylvania, and this was by the guy from Rhode Island, and they're claiming it's Rhode Island style framing, so I'm not quite sure. But it's a kind of framing that they only framed these upside down U shapes, and then they used the siding to hold the building together. The barn is what they call, it's the form that's called the Schweitzer barn, the original kind of a Pennsylvania barn, which is where it hangs out over a forebay, in this case a posted forebay, but it actually isn't that. Hold on, you'll see that in a moment. But this is in the tool shed. Every tool they used to build the house is still in there. And this is where I wanted to remember to say they have what Uncle Aaron had tied to his foot, which is the foot-pedaled lathe that my grandmother described when I was little. And my grandmother also talked about her grandmother making rugs on a loom, and there's a loom from 1810 that's in one of the rooms of this shed. It's built in. And they have records of how much cloth the women made on the loom each year. Go ahead. But when you look at the barn, the overhang of the barn is not structurally designed the way it's supposed to. It's got these little spindly joists, and it's supposed to have real big logs coming out, if any of you know enough about barns. It's because I think they just thought they wanted it to look like that kind of a barn, but they didn't know what it was, so they just built it anyhow. It's a very large barn, and it's 1803. And when you're inside, you can see how large it is. It's got a couple of other unusual features, but this is that little skinny space out in the front, which is supposed to be part of the working area where they thresh the hay and thresh the wheat and so forth. Go ahead. I got, in the middle of, right after I got the arrangements for this last project, I was desperately looking for things to do in the year after getting laid off, and last year was probably the worst year. The report last year was that architects were the most laid off profession in America, and that all the money that was supposed to be designed to help the poor was going to the professionals last year. But I also didn't qualify for unemployment after I started doing these, because you don't qualify to do both. So I had to survive off of what I could. And I applied for a fellowship from the Athenaeum, which is a big old 18-teens library in Philadelphia. It's like a gentleman's club, and they specialize in, they started off as like a Duquesne club, but they specialize in architecture books. They have the definitive collection of all the paint charts that were ever printed. And they gave me a fellowship of just a few $1,000s to study farmland. And I wrote a paper that I'm hoping to publish someday as a book on the Pennsylvania farm landscape as a historic resource. I don't think it's just the house that's historic. And you might think of ways this applies to things here. For instance, when we started with this group, we were fighting to save Beacon Gardens, which is Hamilton Cottages, famous for its landscape as well as the row houses that went around it. But when they redid it, and we felt they were taking away some of its preservation quality, and they were more worried about putting in air conditioning and things. They chopped down the trees and things, and they were talking about, I don't remember what they did, but they were talking about putting parking in. So it was half landscape, and so was Forbes Terrace and so forth. So landscape does relate. I looked at Chester County, Lancaster County, and Washington County, and look at how different they look from the air, and how similar Washington County is to Chester County, even though this is way out on the eastern edge of the state. And I traced farm boundaries and crop patterns and things like that, and how the farm was laid out. And I came to these conclusions, and this is my last slide, so if anybody's getting tired, go ahead to the next. I looked at all these atlas drawings. Have any of you used these atlases that have these wonderful three-dimensional drawings in them of farms? I don't think you're just looking at buildings with space in between. I think you're actually looking at working land. It's really not landscape like landscape architecture. It's working land. It's like a factory. And so every bit of this is laid out like you lay out a factory. And you need to know when you're working it, but also when you're analyzing it, what a meadow is, and what an upland is, and what a a woodlot is, because those are parts of a farm. The meadow is the lower land below the barn. It's usually wetland, and it produces really thick hay. In the first few years, all the hay went to the barn from the wetland because it was really thick down there. But then they realized they had to rotate the fields. So as they gradually cleared the fields coming up from the barn, and then the barn was downhill, that allowed them to bring the crops down to the barn. They realized they had to rotate these fields to keep them fertile because that got animals out into them and got the manure out into them. In Lancaster County, let's go back one point to make this point. This is very level land, and the reason it looks so different is because it's so valuable, it's so level, and it's so fertile that they just keep it clear and full of crops. But they can only do that because they cart every bit of barnyard cow manure out to the fields. But the difference between that and Washington County, anybody know what Washington County's #1 agricultural trend was? And we're right in the midst of this. We're right on the edge of it because it's several counties. Washington and Greene counties were the top number of merino sheep of any counties in the United States. But even before they got into the fine bull sheep, they were handling ordinary sheep. And the reason they were is the land's so steep that you couldn't possibly manure the outer fields with a cart. So it didn't matter what happened to the barnyard manure. You had to get sheep out into those hillside fields. And as soon as you take the sheep off of them, the weeds come. And my friend who works with me on this, she and I have been developing these ideas for years. She says she claims to have heard a country western song years ago, those corny lyrics, that the only thing that grows is multiflora rose. When you take sheep off of the land, wild rose takes over and other plants like that. You can't get it off any other way than you get the sheep back there to eat it. So I was learning the relationships between manure and animals and fields and so forth. And I'll go back to that diagram again, and I'll try to wrap up. So this was a farm in, I think, Lancaster County. This was one in Chester, Greene, and Washington. And they look a little different. But when you start studying them, you start noticing the meadow is always below the barn. There's always an embankment, or almost always. The barn is almost always banked. The animals are in the basement. Above the barn, there's an area where you could stack hay. And you need a certain kind of landscape. It needs to be very strong land, not slippery, land that's going to slide around. And you gradually work your way up, clearing the fields, but you end up with some wood out on the ridges. And then as you go downstream, along the stream that flows through the meadow, you're going to put the privy downstream from the house. And you can have the spring house upstream from the house. That's just common sense, so you have good water. And you're going to have the barn close to the spring too, or you're going to end up carrying water for your animals. These relationships are relatively fixed across Pennsylvania, and this is as much like a house as it is like landscape architecture. This is the rooms of a house or the rooms of a factory. It's just like you wouldn't put your laundry out, in 2 doors away if you could have it next to the bedroom or whatever. It's that kind of a thing. So anyhow, that's what I've been working on, and that's what I did with my summer vacation. I don't know if I'll be coming back to Squirrel Hill very much, but I am thinking about moving back to Western Pennsylvania. I have one large project in Philadelphia with a big department store that's being rehabilitated. The Strawbridge and Clothier Company, if any of you know that. And it's being made into offices. And if it ever winds down, I'm thinking about coming back somewhere in this area. But maybe we'll get a chance to keep working together. So thank you very much.
When you were talking about lighthouses, you mentioned something about fourth order lenses. What does that mean?
They were, the largest ones were called first order, and they were the largest distance you could get light to go was 18 miles. A first order light is like this tall, down to the floor, and they usually rotate. A fourth order light is about this big and it fits on a table. So I guess I've never seen a third order or a second order, but they're the in-between sizes. But most of the fourth order lights are missing because people have taken them as antiques. It's easy to break in and get them.
You have been able to have some kind of communication with people who lived around the beginning of the last century, and that makes me think that here in this area there must have been quite a number of Indians still living around in the various areas.
an interesting question. The Iroquois claimed the area until 1768, and they gave it up in 1769 at a treaty at Fort Stanwix, which is where we have Stanwix Street in downtown Pittsburgh. Fort Stanwix was up in New York. The Iroquois were actually up in New York. They had Indians out in this area that were in small bands that were called Mingos. And the reason they're called Mingos is that's an Iroquois word for renegade. So they were kind of the step cousins to the Iroquois. But keep in mind, as far as your question goes, 1769 is even. My grandmother told me about her grandmother. Her grandmother was born in 1835. I can't get back to 1769. I didn't talk to anybody who talked to anybody in 1769. So the Indians were pretty much gone that far back, and there were only small bands of them. But I will answer your question another way. Now that you have the internet, you can go online, and there is a very small number of people in the northern panhandle of West Virginia who speak Mingo, which is a dialect of Seneca and Iroquois, and there actually is such a thing as a Mingo language that about 3 people speak. And you can read their stories and their jokes and everything else, and how they translate into English. So there was another answer.
There are several dozen streets in Pittsburgh that have Indian name. A friend of mine did a book about them a number of years ago.
You have another?
Well, how about other aspects of the world that were in this area? Now, the other one is the French aspect. The French and Indian War was very active around here too, and we have many names like Charleroi,
Right.
and etc.
Although
Are French names.
Charleroi came about because they wanted to duplicate the equivalent of Pittsburgh. In Belgium, there's a city just like Pittsburgh called Charleroi. And so it was kind of, I don't want to say a scam, but it was a promotional idea to name this town for this place that would be like going to another state and naming something Pittsburgh. And that was from the 1890s. I think you're right, though, that if there's anything from the French, it's going to be names. I can't say that I know any French aspects of our architecture or our early cooking or anything like that. I'm always watching for that kind of thing. I know that there were supposedly there are 2 books that say there were Italians here by 1810. And I just can't, I've done a lot of work on Italian American culture, and I can't quite get my head around that. Like, who were they, where did they go, that kind of thing. Interestingly, though, if you look at the Scotch-Irish, and some of them were really Huguenots who lived in Ireland, and the Pennsylvania Dutch and so forth, and you put them all together, we have a tremendous number of things from the 1700s from them. Like, there are over 1,000 log houses south of Pittsburgh. And most people in Pittsburgh are shocked to hear that. They don't realize they're living right in the center of log house land. It's just that they're not in the city. Any others?
Thank you.
Thank you again. So nice to be here.
We can see why we have the energy, where it started. Terry, you did great. And once again, I want to thank everyone who's here, especially those who've been here for multiple meetings. We often consider July the end of a year, starting again in September, and we've had a great year in the Historical Society, attendance-wise and support, and I want to thank everyone for that. Make sure that you don't forget us. Come back in September. And I'll end, Terry's inspired me to end with a little historic anecdote that goes to Azita's question. In this area, in 1763, of the Treaty of Paris, which gave British control of the area, to this area, when you read the history down at Fort Pitt, it's a question of the Native Americans and them being pushed back. I just spent 3-4 days in Old Quebec a week before last. And it's interesting, same war, same times. But of course up there the issue was truly the French versus the British. And even today, with a unified Canada and the chances of independence of Quebec have now died again, whenever you go into a museum, 1763 is called the Conquest, the day that the British took over from the French. And they're allowed to say that, and it's one of the days that they celebrate or mourn, as you say. So even in the same war, different parts here and there, it meant very different things. Good night. Come back and see us in September. Have a good end of summer.